Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress, and today I'm going to show you how I made this copper and wood shoe rack in just one weekend. Let's get started. This project is sponsored by Burns & Matic. I've been spending a lot of time in my shop working on really big projects, and I finally found a weekend to just work on something small and something practical for my home. Now, I've been experimenting with a lot of different materials on my channel in the past year or so, and one of those materials that I want to learn more about is copper piping. Last time I worked with copper piping, I made a really cool bar cart, but this time I really wanted to make something a little more practical, and I decided that I was going to make a brand new shoe rack to house all of the shoes that I wear in my workshop. Before getting started on any copper work though, the first thing I wanted to do was prep some lumber for the shelves of my shoe rack. And I decided to do this using 2x6 lumber that I found in my local box store, and I just squared out the edges on my table saw to make a nice straight edge for a glue up. But as always, you can find the full list of materials and products as well as a step-by-step for this project on my website by clicking on the link below this video. I don't know why, but I wanted to go with more of an industrial look for this project, so I decided to go with some chunkier looking shelves, and to do that I did have to glue up those 2x6s into two separate shelf panels. And since I wanted this to be a weekend build, I let these panels sit and dry, and at this point I probably could have started cutting all of my copper pieces, but I decided that I was going to stain these panels later, and since the stain is going to have to dry, I just cut the copper and did all of my copper work while they were drying, and you'll see that a little bit later. But once those panels were dry, it was time to remove them from the clamps and time to prep them for their final finishing steps. I decided to actually run them through the planer at this point as well, but this is totally optional. If you don't have a planer, you can totally skip this step. I really just wanted to get these boards as flat as possible, as fast as possible. And once they were ready to go, I then cut them down to their final length. At some point in this process, I actually decided that I wanted these boards to look really rustic. I didn't love how clean they look, so I decided to torch them using my Burns & Matic torch head and propane tank. I've used this method a ton of times on my channel, and I absolutely love it because it totally brings out the beauty in the grain and also raises the grain a bit in certain parts of the board to make it look really organic. I definitely made sure to not only torch the top of the board, but also get all of the sides and the bottom of the board as well. This is actually going to prevent the boards from cupping or warping. And once I was happy with the coloring and the texture, I then used sandpaper to sand away any of the excess grit and then applied the heat one more time just to get out a little more detail in the wood. I then wiped away any of the excess charcoal and brought the boards inside to prep them for finish. Although I really love the finished texture of the boards, I did not love the coloring, and I decided that I wanted to go darker to contrast with the copper piping, so I decided to stain the shelves for the shoe rack with an ebony colored stain. I then let the boards dry, and at this point it was time to start the copper work. To get started here, I measured my 1/2-inch copper piping into side pieces and leg pieces, but again, you can find those measurements on my website if you are looking for them. I then used a self-adjusting copper pipe cutter to cut all of my pieces. And this tool is pretty rad because all you have to do is attach it to the copper pipe on your marking, twist it around a whole bunch of times, and then you have a beautifully cut copper pipe. So after lots of cutting and a pretty great arm workout, if I'm being real here, I finally started to lay out all of my pieces into some sort of dry fit for my sides. I also started laying out all of the elbows and the fittings just to see what I was working with. And once I was happy with the layout, it was time to start soldering the copper. To get started, I clamped my copper in my benchtop vise and used a towel to prevent the copper from getting damaged. I then scuffed up the ends of the copper piping using sandpaper that came with my soldering kit. And once the ends were properly prepped, it was also time to clean the inside of the fittings using a wire brush. I then added some flux to the inside of the piping as well as to the connecting piece. And flux is really important because it actually helps the solder flow into the joint, making a really solid connection. Once everything is prepped and ready to go, it is then time to heat the joint using a flame and apply the solder. And something I've learned in soldering projects before is that it's really important to heat the copper itself and not apply the flame directly to the solder because the solder will not adhere to the copper piping correctly if it is too hot. Now, originally when I started soldering this project together, I was working with one pipe and one connection at a time, and I actually realized that that wasn't the best way to do things because I couldn't make sure that things were perfectly aligned. So instead, I went back to the drawing board a little bit and started to assemble larger parts of the side pieces together before soldering them to make sure that everything was aligned. And because I didn't do this in the beginning of the project, there were a couple of pieces that do look a little weird in the end result, and I'm not really stoked about it, but it is what it is. I guess it's just a lesson learned, and I'll just do better next time. But once I got into a really good flow, I was actually able to complete all of the soldering for this project in a little over an hour, which was really great timing. And a few other life lessons that I learned during this part of the project were that it was really helpful to have a wet rag around to wipe away any of the dripping solder. And also, any stickers that were left on the copper were very easily removed by applying the fire from the torch and then wiping them down with that wet rag. And once I was done fabricating the two sides to the shoe rack, it was then time to polish up the copper using a 320 grit sandpaper, and when I was happy with that finish, I then began to fit the shelves. And because the shelves are essentially floating in between the two side pieces, it was way easier to clamp them to the side pieces, turn the entire thing upside down, and then attach them to the copper using clips. And I completed this process by starting with the top panel first, and then once that was in place, I moved on to the bottom panel and made sure that everything was perfectly aligned. And as much as I want to say that I was totally done with the project at this point, I wasn't, because here's what happened.
Nope, I hate it.
Yep, I literally hated it. I felt like it was missing something, it was way too plain, so I decided in this moment that I was going to add some more copper piping to the sides to make it look a little more appealing. And to do that, I measured and marked where I wanted to make my adjustments, use my copper pipe cutter to cut away the top portion of the build from the legs, and then began to add all of my decorative pieces from there. I then joined these pieces using the same exact soldering techniques that I used in the rest of the project, and once I was done, I then buffed out the copper using 320 grit sandpaper and a Scotch-Brite pad before bringing it outside to give it its final coat of spray. So while this isn't the most complicated project I've ever made, it was really nice to be able to squeeze a fun and easy weekend build into my busy work schedule. And now that I've become a little more comfortable with working with copper piping, I can't wait to see the possibilities that this opens up for me in terms of furniture bases or legs or just random things that I can incorporate into fun builds. But for now, I just have this adorable copper and wood shoe rack for all of my work shoes. I really hope you all enjoyed this fun weekend project, and if so, please make sure to subscribe to my channel for more projects in the very near future. But until next time, friends, thank you so much for watching my videos, and happy DIYing.